it's that time again when I don't have reception for, so I can't, excuse me, can't listen to anything else unless I remember to download something ahead of time, and I don't think ahead enough, so here we are. But I've been thinking about what to talk about when this time comes around, so I guess it's time to be mashpia instead of to be Merkavah a little bit. Step up and certainly in the Kabbalistic sense to be a man. I've been thinking a lot about this whole issue of disclosure. I watched half of Dr. Greer's movie that just came out called Unacknowledged. It's on Amazon. Excuse me. Very well made documentary. Interesting. I'm certainly skeptical because, nothing that he presents is in your face conclusive to me. But he seems to be pretty convinced. That's the thing. There's a room for healthy skepticism, but also to know, to be just as skeptical, I would say. The natural knee-jerk reaction would be to say that this is all fantasy, but I think there should be just as much healthy skepticism that this could possibly be true. I know that would to most people sound to be the opposite of skepticism, but essentially I feel that one should be just as skeptical of what the mainstream feeds us, what science, mainstream science, which often ignores the scientific method. Mainstream, that's something I learned as a little kid, is that, we base things on, for something we call science, there's a scientific method. And for something to be scientifically proven, it's done with the scientific method, with a control, with an experiment, and so forth. And still, it's not totally conclusive. Dr. Greer claims that the evidence that he has, he's saying this as an MD, the evidence that he has for UFOs and so forth is far more conclusive than the evidence, or there's at least more, I don't know, he didn't actually say it's more conclusive, but there's more empirical evidence for his claims than there is for the medicines that we administer in our hospitals. And he's saying that as an MD. Meaning, if this much information was out there for anything else, it would be considered scientifically conclusive. I've heard similar claims be made excuse me, about the apologetics for the Jewish faith, for the Sinai experience particularly, which I think was, like I said, the ultimate disclosure event. And really, that being said, it's interesting how Dr. Greer says, everything is hidden in plain sight right in front of your eyes. And in a way, disclosure, I always heard, and a lot of folks have said that disclosure would mean the end of organized religion. And I said in the previous video, I think it's quite the opposite. There's a movie, it's very famous. I don't know who decided that this was the worst movie ever made, but it's famously, even in Seinfeld, they said the worst movie ever made. So I guess that lends a certain canonical quality to a child of the 90s. Because I think it's had that title at least since the 70s, a movie from the 9 from Outer Space. I definitely don't consider it the worst movie ever made. Especially in the 70s, there are a lot of movies that to me are totally unwatchable. But Plan 9 from Outer Space, you can always make it through that movie with a smile and enjoy it. And it's definitely cheap, definitely low budget, but working with what he had, I think Wood made a pretty interesting film, to say the least. Really wasn't widely distributed in its first run. It was really a big deal. In fact, he was surprised years later that anyone even remembered it. But at one point, now the interesting thing about the history of that movie was that, as they mentioned in the film Ed Wood, but I think they dramatized it a little bit more than it actually was that the financial backers of the film were from a Baptist church, and so they said they would only support the film if there was some religious element to the film. And there are a few mentions of God in the film, which are rare. Outright mentions of God are very rare in 50s sci-fi. I can think of a few others. I can think of War of the Worlds, which is Forrest J. Ackerman, who's considered the expert, considered to be the best science fiction film ever made. That movie really though feeds into, it's kind of the opposite of what we're saying here. And Invaders from Mars, the boy does pray at one point in the film. Those are both in color and in 1953, incidentally, right? War of the Worlds was also 53. Day the Earth Stood Still from 51 certainly has religious elements. The fact that the name that Platoon takes on is Carpenter is certainly a reference to the one who's revered in Christianity, who's said to have been a carpenter. But I would say, the scene in War of the Worlds, there's a minister who goes to approach the UFOs, saying that these are beings of higher intelligence, so they must be closer to God, and he's walking to them holding a Bible, and then they just zap him and destroy him. And if you listen to Dr. Greer, that's almost a warning, not about the real reality of extraterrestrial life, but Dr. Greer has interesting claims of a conspiracy of a false flag operation, which is something I've discussed even before really I started really paying very much attention to Dr. Greer. I think I'd heard of him before then, but I had mentioned that my theory was that if Hillary Clinton would have won, and thank God she didn't, she would have staged a false flag UFO attack. My feeling is now that our very blessed President Donald Trump, who's really somewhat of a tragic figure in many ways, will probably be victim of an attack that some of the powers that be from the military-industrial complex that go over the head of constitutionality of our government. The president, according to the Constitution, is supposed to be the commander-in-chief. And with these aspects throughout history, the president has been denied security clearance because he awareness, maybe not full awareness of what exactly was going on, but especially what he said to Jimmy Kimmel is quite telling. When it comes to Donald Trump, I feel that he is, since he's an outsider, he's really an alien in a sense in Washington, more than Klaatu was even in the day there stood still. If you really look into what he's going through and everything, and essentially he's a total outsider. He has no connection to what's going on, and I really wouldn't be surprised if he would not knowledge, or if he would be a victim of this. But that being said, Dr. Greer brings out in the film, I don't want to give away too much of the film. I think people should purchase or rent the film and watch it themselves. It's really worthwhile. Even if you're a total skeptic, see what he has to say. But my feeling as a person of faith, going back to Plan 9 from Outer Space, in that film, the aliens, the extraterrestrials, say to the military men there, and I think really Plan 9 from Outer Space in a sense is one of the most accurate portrayals of certain things, of how he says, the military brass is keeping his mouth shut, of what he knew he saw, and that's something that I'm surprised was even out there in the late 50s, because there have been many people from the military in the past few decades who have stood up and said just what he said in that movie. But also the fascinating thing was that one of the aliens said God would not allow the Earth to destroy the whole universe. And the Earth's man, the military man, he says, "You speak of God?" And then there's this very tender moment where the alien, he says, "Are you so arrogant and stupid to think that we too would not have a concept of God?" And I think the reality is that the minister in War of the Worlds was right. These extraterrestrial beings are closer to God than we are. I mean, the Rambam talks about different levels of angels, and the lowest level, which are called Ishim, which means men, are said to have physical bodies and eat. They eat manna. Manna is their food, physical food, to maintain their physical bodies. But the fascinating thing is that the highest level angels, the Chayos HaKodesh, are described as traveling in vehicles. Merkavah, which usually, throughout the Bible, just simply means a regular chariot, wagon, and it means any type of vehicle. And but it's described that both earthly, very simple earthly Merkavos, vehicles, but there's also heavenly Merkavos. I mean, whether you want to say chariot, vehicles, whatever it is, these things are described in the Bible, and so are the Ofanim, which are described as a species of angel. but that these are angelic beings, and like Dr. Greer has said, that the saucer crafts are actually alive and have a level of intelligence. And that's something that to me is quite fascinating, that it's not that Ezekiel saw some 50s style flying saucers that came at or less than the speed of light over millions of years to get here, which is quite ridiculous. But he saw angels, but these angels are indeed actually angels who are vehicles. I mean, Dr. Greer mentions that he spoke to a theologian from the Vatican who said, well, angels don't need spaceships to travel. But in a way, these craft are angelic, meaning they are beings who are closer to God, who have intelligence, who have awareness. They probably do not have, although there's a whole discussion in Jewish theology and angelology as to whether angels have free will the way human beings do. It's a point of contention. It's not universally accepted one way or the other, although in general we say angels do not have free will. Certainly their level of awareness of God robs them of much of their free will. And that's really part of the plan of humanity, is that we are separated from these things in order to maintain our free will. But that's a major aspect of Jewish theology, is that part of the reason why there is this mix of disclosure, and because we had disclosure at Sinai, and yet it's being denied right in front of our faces, even though it's so obviously true, and is just so we can maintain our free will, and recognize our own frailty, our own mortality. An interesting thing, Dr. Greer mentioned something about his seeing and photographing an extraterrestrial ambassador. He has a picture of it, and at one time I heard he described this being several times, and one time he says it looks like he's wearing a yarmulke. But he says it's actually a device by which he can travel and so forth. And I think it's interesting that he should say that, but also it's interesting, if you look at the shape of the yarmulke, it is the flying saucer shape. If you look at the shape of the hats that the Hasidim wear, the traditional hats, not the fedoras that Lubavitch wears and that the Lithuanians wear, that was outlawed by the Tsar. The traditional hats were outlawed by the Tsar, and that's why in Russia they started to wear the fedora, which was the general style, because the Russian government outlawed Jews from wearing the traditional Jewish hats. But the Strymel and the Bieber hit, the bend-up hat, all of them, and the various types of Bieber hit, all, and the yarmulke, which is worn by most Jews, at least for prayer, and is the saucer shape. And it's quite possible that that's related to Merkavah, to the Ofanim, the Chayas HaKodesh. We have imagery of the Chayas HaKodesh in our synagogues. That's why one image that is permitted in a synagogue is a lion, because that's one of the images on the Merkavah, on the divine chariot. Even though that's a controversial issue, but it's part of the tradition that's worn, that is displayed, that the image of the lion is in most synagogues. Also, there's a meditation, the Merkavah meditation, that you'll find in the Sefer Sha'ar Tzion, which is a Kabbalistic guidebook. I had a copy of it, and I loaned it one time to a particular tzaddik who I was accompanying, and then the book just disappeared, and I always wanted to get this Sefer back. I picked up in Yerushalayim, and I haven't been able to find another copy. However, the same thing has been printed in other Sidurim. I have the Siddur from Told Savram Yitzchak, that there's the meditation, which it says in the Ma'aser Merkavah. It says in the Siddur, and it's Hareni Kavan Lasis, it's Atzmi Kiser Merkavah L'Shechina Kedosha, that a person should have in mind to make himself a throne and a vehicle for the divine presence, for the Shechina, for the Holy Shechina. And with that kavana, it brings that we should have in mind different parts of the body, how either in gematria or the corresponding sephiros represent the name of God. For example, each of the sephiros is associated with different vowels under the tetragrammaton, and to have in mind the corresponding body parts, that we are carrying God with us, that we are vehicles for God's presence in the world, and that by doing so, the Sfarim HaKadoshim say that this is great. So this is something you could do many times a day, and it's good to do before praying, and it's something that many Kabbalists and Hasidim have, those who practice Kabbalistic meditations. You don't find that in like Chabad, other places, but the mainstream Hasidim practicing Kabbalistic meditations, that we are making ourselves a vehicle for God's presence, meaning that we are experiencing godliness in the world, and through our actions, through our lives, we're bringing God into the world. And the meditation, though, it's interesting that we are making ourselves into this vehicle. The Sfarim say, Ha'avos hein hein Merkavah, that the patriarchs are, or were, or are the Merkavah, and that we, if we work hard on ourselves, we can become Merkavah. Not only that we enter a Merkavah and travel somewhere, but we become a Merkavah. And perhaps that's part of the reason for our traditional hat shapes to be so similar, especially like the Yerushalmi style, the old Hungarian style, the Satmar wear, not like I wear, but there's one that's lower. It's like half as tall as this. Usually has a wider brim. It looks, I mean, people make fun of it, that, oh, it's a flying saucer,